Okay, so finally, to wrap up our segments and wrap up our show, we have this really great article that I don't know if Steve wants to introduce it and where it came from, and then we can kind of discuss it and what this is about.
Yeah, it's an article called "All Grace, No Nature." The subtitle: Evangelicalism is not ready for the culture's rightward shift, and it's by is it World Magazine?
Yeah, it's World Magazine.
Okay. That's what it says.
Which is a good publication.
Yep. Yeah. So what he's talking about briefly in this is, we've all seen a cultural shift. It's kind of a relieving thing, I think, in a lot of ways, and
right.
it's very encouraging to see, and where the culture is starting to shift away from the LGBTQ and everything's racist, la 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 thing, and all those kind of things that. As I whack the microphone, and the whole thing that he's saying in this article is that evangelicals are not ready for this shift.
Yeah,
and go ahead, tell it.
Yeah, so I think maybe to backpedal just a little bit on that. One of the reasons why this is concerning is because all the research indicates that Gen Z is forecasted to become the most conservative generation on record.
And I think we mentioned that last.
Yeah, we talked about. Well, we were talking about that in terms of church attendance.
Yes,
but this is, I would say,
trend.
Culturally, socially, politically conservative, and this is particularly true, according to the article, of young men who are decidedly more conservative. And he gives some explanation here of like, why is this the case? And it's because the left overshot, and essentially progressivism went too far. It assumed that everyone would accept social progressivism's fascination with identity, inclusion, political correctness, and simply overwhelm the opposition owing to the cultural majority that elites enjoy. So they just figured that everybody was going to, once we let them know, for years you heard this from the left, that as soon as the rest of the country is as educated as we are, this is the way it's going to go. The reality is that it's just not the case. And that's what's kind of happened with this younger generation. They become disillusioned with progressivism. They're questioning the social dogmas of the progressive movement. And as part of that, they're reconsidering traditional values. I mean, if you were to go on YouTube, for example, type in the trad wife movement and see how many young women want to be traditional wives again.
Yeah.
And by traditional wife,
mentions that in the article too.
Yeah, and by traditional wife, what do we mean? We mean the homemaker, the person taking care of the child, the traditional gender role that always existed.
Yeah. There's a big fad in that right now.
There's a huge movement, and they're all the younger millennials and Gen Z, mostly Gen Z, but there are some on the cusp of that, those two generations that are jumping onto that. And again, not just roles, but the ideals. These younger people are re-exploring the masculine ideal, the feminine ideal, and they are once again desiring order and permanence. And we talked about this in relation to institutions. Part of wokeism was to categorize institutions as oppressor or oppressed so that you could then get rid of the oppressor institutions.
Yeah.
But the younger folks are like, wait a minute, this just is not my lived experience.
Yeah.
And so they're looking for the institution to come back or to kind of
saying that institutions aren't all bad.
Right. Institutions are not all bad. And even within that, and I don't remember if we really discussed it in the church attendance thing, but even within the church attendance movement that we're seeing an increase among younger people of church attendance, a lot of those are going to the more traditional churches, the churches that have a stated liturgy, that are sacramental, that are, holding on to sort of traditions, lowercase t, of the historic church. There is a definite move that way. And I know I've seen articles recently about young men especially becoming Eastern Orthodox, but we're really seeing it across the board in the liturgical churches.
And in the Roman Catholic Church, the Latin Mass is picking up.
Oh, yeah.
Huge.
And when you go to a Latin Mass, you know what's there? Families.
Yep.
Young families with 7, 8 kids, 5 kids, 4 kids. And you know,
And there's a lot of reverence for the Eucharist.
There's a ton of and you know, you would think if you're going to the mass that has all the young kids that it would be a screaming mass, and it's really not. It's these are families that are really taking things very seriously. And so basically what he says is evangelicals are not ready for this because evangelicalism has failed probably for the last 100 years, but maybe especially for the last 50 to 60 years, has failed to speak affirmatively of creaturely instincts that progressives have been attacking for decades.
Yeah.
To me, you know, and I'm going to make sort of a really broad statement here. I have long felt that American evangelicalism is really Gnostic. And let me explain how I think that works with this. So first of all, why is American evangelicalism Gnostic? Because it spiritualizes everything. That's the first thing. On the extreme ends, it's hyper spiritualized. So that's when you get into like the charismatic stuff, and I don't even mean just the nutty people like Paula White. I mean sort of like the norms of the charismatic movement is a hyper spiritualization of things.
Yes.
That's the definition of what it is to be Gnostic. So then how that relates to this is that essentially evangelicalism has nothing positive to speak to in terms of the created order, other than saying, you know, that we support traditional values. Well, what does that mean? You support traditional values. What is the role of husband and father? How do you live that out? And how is and when you're kind of like going along to get along, like these are our values, but we're not going to force them on the culture.
Exactly. Which what they've done.
Why don't we realize that there is good in the created order, not just for the church, it's for everybody. That's why it's part of the created order.
Right.
You know, when we talk about, now I don't know what your position is on this, but I get a lot of requests for weddings outside of the church from people that are not, you know, I do not require that I do not require that, I will not marry a Christian to a non-Christian.
Okay.
I don't require that the two people both be my kind of Christian. They don't have to be Lutherans. They don't even have to be from the same tradition. Like I'll marry a Lutheran to a Methodist or a Catholic or something like that.
Methodist?
Yeah, absolutely, you know. But I won't marry a believer to a non-believer. And there's a reason, because I think Paul won't allow me to participate. I think when Paul says don't be unequally yoked, it is your responsibility to make sure you're not. But I'm not going to put my stamp of approval on it if you are. But I will marry two non-believers to each other.
Because they're equally yoked.
Well, yeah, but they're equally yoked, but also because marriage is a creation.
Right.
It's a right of creation. Right. It's not something that the church owns.
It's not something only for Christians.
Right. It's not just for Christians. And so we evangelicals, they basically have, what they've done is they've said, okay, so all of these traditional values that we stand for they're okay for us, but we're not going to make you do it. It's not for society as a whole. So they don't really have anything to say. If the culture begins to shift, they have nothing to say to that culture because they've already surrendered that ground.
Yeah.
They've said, what do they say things like, we live in a post-Christian culture. Okay, well, that's true to some extent. The culture has been post-Christian in terms of they don't all go to your churches. But we discussed this, by the way, in our culture segment a few weeks ago, that the culture in America is still Christian. It's still a Christian culture. Because of how culture is actually defined. What the evangelicals have done is they've essentially said, because the loudest voices in the culture are those who are progressive and it looks like the country's going in that direction, we're just going to have our Christian schools, we're going to have and don't write and say Christians that I think Christian schools are bad. I don't. But we're going to have like this, we're going to be separate but equal kind of thing, right? Like segregation almost. We're going to self-segregate ourselves, and these things are for us. And we're not going to try to shape the culture in any way, shape, or form, so that it reflects these values. So they've lost the ground already.
Yep. Let me read one paragraph from this based on what you're saying. This is a good point to read it. This is says, so when the culture, weary of chaos, begins to grope back towards its outer boundary, natural law violations, evangelicalism will fumble unless we relearn the value of nature. We must be able to affirm the goodness of maleness and femaleness, which is what you're saying we've kind of haven't done.
Right.
The goodness of hierarchy and authority, the goodness of limits, the good of the family, the good of conscience and moral law. And then lastly, this is why many evangelicals find themselves uncomfortable with the language of authority, duty, or rootedness.
Right, absolutely. And if you go back the paragraph above, I must have underlined multiple things in here because essentially the story for evangelicals goes from the fall to the cross. That's what he says in the article.
He says that straight there.
And that really is kind of evangelicalism in a nutshell. It goes from, oops, we made a mistake, to this is how it's rectified. And there's no discussion about the good of creation.
Right.
And I wondered kind of like, where does that come from? Is it because evangelicals are by and large separated between Arminianism and Calvinism, and the Calvinist view is that mankind is totally depraved, creation is totally fallen, and all that kind of stuff. For Lutherans, it's a different view. We're not quite. We definitely don't believe in total depravity. I think if we were to use a word,
I think the Calvinist view is more utterly depraved.
Utterly depraved.
You know what I mean?
Even though they say it's totally depraved.
It's like there's no good left.
Yeah.
But Methodists, we don't believe that. We believe there is good.
Right, I was going to say, I don't think
creation is a good. Our existence is a good.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that would be more in line with what how Lutherans understand the created, not just creation, but the created order. These are good things. Why are they good? Because God is good and God made them. God can't make things that are not good. Now, these things have been disturbed.
I believe sin's touched everything.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, right.
And that's where I would say, I don't want to speak for Lutherans writ large, but how I would describe sin's effect is total corruption. I would say everything is corrupted, including myself. But that doesn't mean that everything is by nature not good. It means that all good things have been corrupted, including human nature, including the created order, including institutions, including hierarchy, including authority, including so what we
that doesn't
actually
mean they're not
see,
good. It doesn't mean there's no good in them.
It doesn't mean they're not good. And so essentially what evangelicals did is, because they don't have any language to talk about those things outside of a church context, and maybe because look, there's been a lot of scandals in the last probably 25 years in evangelical circles that have to do with authority and have to, like, an abuse of authority. Like you think of Mark, who was that guy, Mars Hill guy? Mark Driscoll. That was an authority issue. Then you have somebody like Ravi Zacharias who had a sexual issue, and a lot of these things. And maybe that's why they shy away from it. I don't know enough about historical evangelical theology, and by that I mean like from the 50s backwards, maybe, to the 1800s, to know like what was their position on things before, because I don't think they really existed, right? I mean, evangelicals were basically people in mainline traditions. It wasn't like their own separate thing. So they just don't have the language. They don't have the language to deal with it. But he goes on in this and he says they don't have consideration of what original created nature was for. What was it? What was the purpose of it? So they don't have the capacity to speak about the created world as being good in itself. So they can't present these values as something everybody should adopt.
I mean, the Westminster Confession says man's chief end is to glorify God.
But that would be reformed, though. I wouldn't class them as...
I know, evangelical.
Yeah, I wouldn't class them as evangelical. I mean, they are
a lot of evangelical come out of that.
And absolutely. Yeah. But how far out of it is the problem?
It's been hundreds of years.
I would say that only the most conservative Presbyterians really pay any attention to the confessions of the Reformed movement, right? Same thing with, churches like the Dutch Reformed Church, Christian Reformed Church. Do they even pay attention to the canons of Dort and all that kind of stuff? I don't know. I know that there's a couple Reformed denominations who clearly do.
Yeah,
they tend to be the more conservative groups. So the evangelicals themselves, I mean, when I think of evangelicals, Most of the evangelicals I'm aware of, most of the let me classify this right.
Like non-denom and stuff.
Well, but yeah, I would say non-denominational pretty much come from the Baptists. The Baptists, by and large, are independent churches, right? I mean, the most Baptists don't belong to a denomination,
right?
Or they belong to something like the SBC, which technically is not a denomination.
It'll be interesting to talk about the David Platt thing with that in mind.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
But then I would say the vast majority of the rest of the evangelical world is descended from Wesleyanism to some degree. Not
a lot of it comes out of Wesleyan.
Yeah, not necessarily the Methodist Church proper or the historic Methodist Church, but some form of Wesleyanism, you know. And so I don't really know, how connected are they to, if you're in the Wesleyan Church, which is like 2 rungs down the ladder from
they are
Methodist
loosely
Church.
Connected with Methodism,
right? So they don't. So how much do they really know about what those confessions actually say? But the biggest issue for me is that I think, like I said, I think that the Gnostic nature of American evangelicalism prevents them from being able to see this stuff, which is all material, which is all created, which is human institutions, which is connected to the wider culture, how they can see that as good. And if they don't have the language for it, they're not going to be able to say to the culture, hey, you should do this too, because it's good. It's good for your kids. It's good for the culture. It's good for the nation.
Without saying just because.
Without saying just because.
Yeah.
So I did want to mention it because we had talked about this, and this could be a possible framework for it. First of all, I'm really glad to hear that Methodists share this view, because for Lutherans, we just automatically believe that because God's good, creation has to be good. Using Genesis 1, obviously. And for Lutherans, God is continuing to create. His sustaining of the world is part of his creative act in the world, and that he gives us orders of creation, or created orders, which refer to our social structures,
which the scriptures speak of.
Our relationships, family, church, the state. Luther, we use the small catechism today to train our confirmands, but that's not why Luther wrote it. He wrote it for pastors to train their congregations and for fathers to train their kids.
Interesting.
That's what the catechism was meant for. He went on a trip. This was kind of like in the middle of the Reformation, as churches were peeling off and becoming part of the Lutheran movement, the evangelical movement, as it was called then. And he went what's called the Church Visitations, and he came back and he was like flabbergasted. He's like, I can't believe how messy this really is. These priests don't know anything about the gospel at all. They have no clue. So he wrote the Small Catechism for that purpose, and we just don't use it rightly anymore. I mean, mostly because parents don't teach their kids anymore. They just leave it to the pastor. But all of this stuff, he calls the family the micro church. It's the family is the basic unit, not just of the society, but of the church. So this training and this stuff should be happening in the family. And then how does that affect the culture? Well, each of us has a vocation, and we have a responsibility. And this is one of the unique contributions of Luther to the wider Christian world. That you don't have to be a priest, a monk, a nun to have a vocation from God.
Right.
The farmer has a vocation. The
mother.
The mother has the highest
Huge
vocation.
vocation.
In fact, there's one quote that I'm going to butcher where he says that a mom changing dirty diapers has done more for the Lord than 1,000 popes sitting on 1,000
Amen.
Thrones.
Yeah.
And what sin did is that it disturbed this inherently good creation that ultimately disrupted the natural order. In the back of the Small Catechism, there's a thing that was added on at the end later, a number of years later, called the Table of Duties. And it's literally just are you a father, a mother, a pastor, a bishop, a worker, a boss, whatever you are, whatever your station in life is, this is what Scripture says you're supposed to be doing in that vocation, always with an eye towards serving your neighbor. Because that's really what it's about. God doesn't need you to serve him. He needs you to serve your neighbor. That's what he wants you to do.
Yeah.
And so I think that I would like to see, maybe evangelicals listen to more of us who come from traditions that maybe have something to say about this, or not just evangelicals. I think it's important for that because they have control of the airwaves. But I think it's important for us to make sure that, and for you and I, and maybe for our churches, nothing really changes, right? I mean, we just go on being who we are, and maybe people are attracted to us because of that. And I know I said this on that one episode where we talked about attendance, but all of the growth that my church has had in the last 2 years has been people in their 30s, couples in their 30s who have children. And it's not like we've had exponential growth, right?
Yeah.
I'm just saying that everybody we've
If you're
brought
growing,
in,
you're already ahead of most churches. So
Yeah.
most are shrinking.
and actually in April we're bringing in two couples, and one of them is a younger couple, the other is an older couple that's because they're part of the diocese here, and their parishes are being shut down, so they but in any case, for us nothing changes, right? We're still going to talk the way we talk, and how these things are good for the whole culture. They're good for the nation as a whole, not just for Christians in their little corner. We're not Amish. So well, we hope you enjoyed this episode. Please make sure to share it, like and subscribe to the YouTube page, like and subscribe to the Facebook page, and send this out to your friends, and we'll see you again real soon. God bless.